Sometimes it only takes one wrong assumption to shatter a life's worth of dignity. It was a quiet morning in Asheville, the kind where the sun spills soft light on familiar streets and people move unhurriedly toward routine. But for one aging veteran and his loyal guide dog, that morning veered tragically off course, not because of malice, but because someone failed to pause, to see, to understand. This is not just a story about what went wrong. It's about what we forget to notice until it's too late. And it's about the quiet strength of those who carry scars, some visible, most not, and still keep walking. If you've ever wondered how deep misunderstanding can cut, or how powerful a single act of presence can be, then this story is for you. The sharp command, "Hey, step away from that door," shattered the quiet morning like glass thrown against concrete. Walt Briggs stopped in his tracks. One hand steadied itself on his worn wooden cane, the other gently resting on Duke, his guide dog. Walt couldn't hear the tension in the young security guard's voice. His hearing had been dulled long ago by the blast of a shell in a war half the country had forgotten. But Duke heard it, or maybe he felt it, the way animals do, fear vibrating beneath the surface like a coming storm. Then came the crackle of electricity, the taser fired. A whip of sound split the morning, and Duke crumpled with a sharp yelp that made people stop mid-step. Walt dropped beside him, body jerking in shock, arms flailing blindly as he tried to reach his dog. His cane clattered to the ground. The cement sidewalk suddenly became a stage of frozen motion. People stopped, stunned. A woman's scream echoed through the morning air. Cell phones rose in trembling hands to record what had just happened. The young guard stood rigid, his hand still gripping the taser, face drained of color, eyes locked on the man he had just dropped to the pavement. Horror carved into his features like something he would never forget. Moments later, the hum of engines. Military vehicles swarmed the block, sealing off the area with practiced speed. A sleek black SUV came to an abrupt stop, its tinted windows reflecting the rising sun. The door opened, and a four-star general stepped out with controlled authority. His eyes swept the scene. The moment his boots hit the ground, his voice cut through the tense silence. Not loud, but impossible to ignore. "Who did this to Sergeant Briggs?" The sunlight spilled across Asheville's brick storefronts, casting gold and amber streaks across parked cars and windows just beginning to fog with morning condensation. It was the kind of morning that usually invited slow walks and long breaths, a softness in the air that made even busy people pause. Inside the little corner cafe on Lexington Avenue, Emily Shaw cradled her favorite mug, letting the heat warm her hands and the gentle steam curl against her face like a whisper. She'd opened the place at 6:30 on the dot, as she always did, unlocking the door with a familiar turn and flipping the "open" sign before the sun had even properly risen. By 7:15, the usual cast of regulars had started to arrive. The banker with his folded newspaper and obsession with crosswords, the cyclist who only ever ordered green tea and never sat down, and the high school teacher who needed her espresso, dark and biting, to match her Monday mood. Emily knew them all by rhythm and by habit, but there was one person who never came in, never placed an order, and yet she waited for him every morning like clockwork. Walter Briggs. Walt never needed coffee, he never touched the door. But every day at exactly 7:30, Emily would catch sight of him through the big front window as he passed. Calm, steady, deliberate. One hand on his white cane, tapping softly in time with its steps. The other on the harness of his golden retriever, Duke. Loyal, steady, sharp. They moved like a single being, connected, unspoken, fluid. Duke always a step ahead, ears flicking at every sound, nose twitching at scents only he could map. Walt, tall but gently hunched, carried himself with a quiet kind of command that didn't ask for attention. He just was. Most people in Asheville only knew him as the blind man with the yellow-vested dog. They didn't know his name, didn't know that before the blindness, Walt had worn another kind of uniform, that he'd been a sergeant in the Army, a combat veteran with stories etched in scars and silence. They didn't know about the battles or the medal buried in a drawer. They didn't know how long ago he'd lost his vision, decades now, or that he walked these streets not out of habit, but out of resilience. But Emily knew. She remembered one winter morning when an unexpected storm had hit the town. Snow had been falling fast, icy wind curling around corners, and Walt had paused just outside her cafe to adjust Duke's harness. Without thinking, she'd stepped out outside with a cup of cocoa, offered it without a word. He hadn't asked for it, he hadn't even looked up. But he'd nodded and said, "Thank you, miss. Most people don't see us." That moment stayed with her. From then on, she watched him each morning, her eyes always drifting to the sidewalk at 7:30, waiting for that familiar rhythm of man and dog. Walt wasn't a man to pity. He was part of the landscape, a quiet proof that strength didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just moved forward, one step at a time, with grace and trust. That morning, though, something had changed. Walt's routine, so precise it could be set by it, was disrupted. His usual path, honed by years of trust between man and dog, had been altered overnight. A construction crew had rolled in under cover of darkness, tearing up Walnut Street to work on the sewer line. That small detour, just a few feet, wouldn't have meant much to most people. But to Walt, it was like stepping into a storm cloud. The sidewalk where he normally turned had been ripped open. Barricades had gone up, machinery rumbled and screeched, and sharp bursts of noise echoed between the buildings. Jackhammers stabbed the air. Engines grumbled. It was chaos to any passerby. But for Walt, whose world existed in echoes and muscle memory, it was disorienting beyond words. He paused, uncertain. Duke, sensing the change, nudged him slightly to the right. A silent redirection. That small shift, just a few feet, was enough to set everything else in motion. And just like that, the morning unraveled. The sound startled him. That ever-present pressure in his left ear, a souvenir from a ruptured eardrum long ago, twisted certain voices into hollow echoes, others into complete silence. Once, his memory had been sharp, instinctive, like a blade honed in service. Now it flickered, not gone, just eroded. Not Alzheimer's, not dementia, just time. Time mixed with war, with silence, with solitude. It had chipped away at him, piece by quiet piece. The world wasn't made for someone like Walt Briggs anymore. Navigating it felt like walking through a maze built for someone younger, quicker, someone whole. E-scooters littered the sidewalks like forgotten toys. Signs were placed high above reach. Audible crosswalks were rare, almost mythical, and the benches seemed spaced apart like they were afraid of each other. Most doors were puzzles, most apps were walls. Independence had become more than difficult. It had become depleting. Each misstep felt like a tiny failure he had to swallow without complaint, without letting it show. Across the street, Emily Shaw was wiping down the espresso machine when she looked up and saw something that made her pause. Walt, always so predictably consistent, was on the opposite sidewalk today. That wasn't right. He never walked that side. Frowning, she stepped closer to the window and squinted past the morning glare. He was heading down Jefferson Avenue, directly toward the entrance of the Federal Plaza. Her head tilted instinctively. "That's strange," she murmured aloud, more to herself than anyone. He never went that way. But then she noticed the dog, Duke, walking with the same steady, focused rhythm. Walt's posture hadn't changed. That familiar, quiet resolve was still there. Probably just construction up ahead, rerouting them, she reassured herself. Duke knew his job. Walt would be fine. Comforted, she turns back to refill a customer's coffee, unaware that just a block away, something had already started to tilt. A slow, tragic shift built on assumptions and design flaws, and one small misunderstanding. Brian Keller had been on the job for just 3 weeks. He was 22, fresh from a local security training program. His uniform was still stiff with starch, his boots polished nightly to a shine. He had memorized the entire protocol, manual cover to cover. This was his first real assignment, eyes on the ground at the Federal Plaza. His supervisors said he had promise. He believed them. He wanted to believe them. Today he was going to show them they were right. But beneath the pressed name tag and rigid uniform, Brian carried something heavier than his belt. His father, once a cop, always distant, always critical, had left him with a lesson carved deep. Don't hesitate. That was what he'd said after Brian froze during a schoolyard scuffle years ago. Hesitation gets people hurt. It echoed in his bones, so when he saw an older man tall, dressed in dark clothing, approaching the staff-only side entrance with no visible ID, no badge, no pass. Brian's adrenaline spiked. The man didn't look like he belonged, and the dog by his side? Big. The yellow vest might have said service, but Brian didn't see a helper. He saw uncertainty, a threat. No appointment, no clearance, no pause. His training told him, act before it escalates. Back across the street, Emily leaned against the cafe counter, her gaze drawn back to the window again. That entrance, she knew it. Rarely used, hardly maintained, no railing, no audible cues, no textured pavement leading up to it. Walt wasn't trying to go there. He was just following Duke, and Duke was following the curb. They were drifting off course. Her heart kicked up. She pressed her hand to the glass, whispering, No, don't go that way. Inside of the vestibule, Brian stepped forward. His chest was tight, breath clipped. He wasn't supposed to use force unless there was clear danger. But this wasn't about danger anymore. This was about control, about not freezing, about not screwing up. Don't hesitate, he reminded himself. He raised his voice, sharp and commanding. Hey, step away from that door. Walt didn't stop. The wind, the tinnitus in his ears, they swallowed the shout whole. Duke flicked his ears, catching the tension, but kept guiding, loyal and steady. Brian's pulse pounded harder. He's ignoring me. He heard me. He's doing something. Doubt flared, then his suspicion. What if the dog's a cover? A distraction? Emily saw it unfold like a slow-motion dream she couldn't wake from. Brian's hand dropped to his belt. Her stomach twisted. She slammed her fist against the glass with all her strength. He's blind. But her voice didn't carry across the busy street. And the next sound was electric. The sharp crackle of a taser split the air, a violent hiss. The prongs hit Duke's side. The retriever's cry, a piercing, raw yelp, froze people mid-step. A sound so pure and panicked it split the morning calm wide open. His legs buckled instantly. His body convulsed with jolts. And then he crumpled to the ground, motionless except for the residual twitching. Walt stumbled, stunned. The harness jerked out of his grasp, his anchor gone. Confusion etched itself across his face. The world tilted. And in that instant, everything changed. His fingers slipped from the handle. The cane tumbled, striking the pavement with a sharp clatter. One of his knees buckled, crashing to the ground. His palms scraped against the rough asphalt as he reached out blindly, breath short and ragged. From Emily's perspective, it was a sickening sight, an act of senseless cruelty born not from malice, but sheer ignorance. She pushed the cafe door wide and sprinted out, her heart hammering in her chest. From Brian's point of view, the moment shattered everything. The dog hadn't lunged. The man hadn't posed a threat, but in a split-second decision, he'd pulled the trigger. He had just electrocuted someone's anchor to the world. His grip on the taser slackened, and his thoughts exploded with panic. What did I just do? And from Walt's point of view, there was only confusion and terror. He couldn't see the guard. He couldn't hear what anyone was yelling. All he felt was the cold, gritty concrete under his knees, the terrifying emptiness beside him where Duke should have been, and the sharp scent of panic hanging heavy in the air. His voice shook as he whispered, Duke, where are you, boy? A scream pierced the chaos. From the sidewalk, a woman's voice rang out. Another person yelled, angry and confused, What the hell are you doing? But above it all came Emily, her voice cutting through like a blade. He's blind. That's his service dog. But those words came too late. The damage had already torn through the moment like a storm. Duke lay on the ground, his body twitching with the fading pulses of the taser's charge. His golden fur jerked with every spasm, his eyes wide and frightened. Locked for a fleeting instant with Walt's, but Walt couldn't see him. Couldn't see the fear, the confusion in the dog's gaze. Walt collapsed beside Duke, bewildered, unable to piece together what had just happened. His cane was gone. His hands, raw and stinging from the fall, trembled in front of him. But none of it mattered. Nothing mattered but that absence. Reaching out, his voice cracked, pleading, Duke, where are you, buddy? Say something. He was swallowed by uncertainty. He had no bearings. The sounds of the street blurred together with the ringing in his ears. The shock of the taser still buzzed faintly beneath his knees, echoing up from the ground like a ghost. He didn't hear the gasps, didn't register the sob that escaped the girl sprinting across the road. That girl was Claire Thompson. The apron still tied around her waist. She had abandoned the espresso machine mid-pour the instant she saw Walt fall. She dropped everything, feet flying across the street. By the time she reached him, two strangers had joined her. One was a woman in medical scrubs. The other a man in a trucker hat who'd seen the entire thing from his parked pickup. One of them shouted, voice ringing with fury and disbelief, "He's blind! That's his service dog! For God's sake!" The words hit like thunder, slamming into the young security guard. Ethan stood frozen on the sidewalk's edge, the taser still buzzing faintly in his hand. Warm from the discharge, his breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. His wide, stricken eyes stared down at Duke. He had expected pushback, movement, something to justify force. Instead, he was faced with stillness, with suffering, with regret that wrapped around his throat like a noose. Claire dropped to her knees beside Walt, one hand gently resting on his shoulder. "Mr. Briggs, it's Claire from the cafe. I'm right here. Duke's here. He's breathing." Her voice quivered as she reached down and pressed her fingers softly against Duke's side. The dog whimpered, his body still trembling from the shock, but his head lifted slightly. His tail thumped faintly against the ground. Walt turned toward her voice, hand reaching out, finally brushing against Duke's soft fur. His fingers found the dog's ear. Relief surged through him, but it was tangled with guilt and despair. He hadn't seen it coming. He hadn't been able to stop it. He had trusted that the world would understand, and it hadn't. Not this time. A small crowd was gathering now, people filming, people whispering, one phone already broadcasting live. But the silence was louder than their voices. The sidewalk buzzed with disbelief, tension tight in every face that turned toward the scene. Anger, sadness, and that unbearable question written in every pair of eyes: how could this happen? Because this wasn't just a tragic misunderstanding. It was the price of fear, unchecked and unexamined. It was the failure of systems that promised safety, but couldn't deliver it when it mattered most. It was the deep wound left by ignorance, especially ignorance aimed at the quiet, the unseen, the disabled. A wound that cut deeper than anyone ever expects. Still on his knees, Walt held Duke's head gently between both hands, and for the first time in years, he wept openly. Not from the pain in his knees, not from the scrapes or the loss of his cane, but from the terrible truth that no one should have to face. That even now, even here, even after everything, the world still didn't see him. Even though the situation was under control, even though the threat had passed, the old man on the ground could still have been mistaken for the danger. 15 minutes had crawled by since the first jolt of the taser, and in that time the entire street had changed. It wasn't just noise anymore. The low murmur of engines in the distance thickened into a roar, a rolling thunder barreling down Jefferson Avenue. People turned their heads. The crowd instinctively split down the middle, like some invisible pressure was gating them apart. There was something in the air, an unease, a warning that pulsed through their skin. Something big was coming, and nobody knew what, only that it was close. Then the first Humvee appeared. Olive green, streaked in grime, the windows dark and impenetrable, its tires still dusted with memories of war zones half a world away. It didn't weave or hesitate. It pulled up to the curb like it had practiced the maneuver 100 times. Another followed, then another. 3, 4. All of them stopping with surgical precision, one after the other, engines idling like growling beasts preparing to strike. Traffic halted. Pedestrians froze. Even the police cruiser parked lazily at the intersection backed off, inching away without a word. Then, like the final note in an overture, a sleek black SUV glided to the front of the convoy. Windows tinted so dark they might as well have been solid steel. For a long second, nothing moved. Then the rear door swung open. A man stepped out. General Raymond Mallister. 4 stars shimmered on his shoulders, stitched into the deep navy fabric of a dress uniform so flawless it looked untouched by time. Rows of medals lined his chest, catching the morning sun, and throwing it back in flashes of red, gold, and steel. He didn't walk fast. He didn't walk slow either. His stride was exact, controlled, composed. The gait of a man who had nothing to prove and yet had already proven more than most ever would. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The murmurs died. Phones that had been raised to film slowly lowered. Even Ethan, who still gripped his taser like it might disappear from his hand, went pale. His arm dropped as he took an unsteady step back, away from Walt, away from the body lying motionless at Walt's feet. Whatever power Ethan thought he had vanished the moment General Mallister locked eyes with him. Claire shifted out of the way, though her hand remained on Walt's shoulder. She didn't know why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was loyalty. The general gave her a small, sharp nod, not dismissive, not commanding, just enough to acknowledge her steadiness amid the chaos. Then he knelt. Not quickly, not dramatically. Just a clean, deliberate movement down into the dust beside the old man. "Sergeant Walter Briggs," he said, voice low, almost reverent. "Do you hear me, sir?" At the sound of that voice, something stirred. Walt's fingers twitched. Slowly, his head turned toward the sound. His throat caught on the edge of a breath. "Ray," he rasped. "Raymond Mallister." A smile ghosted across the general's face, something private and unspoken flickering behind his eyes. "I'd know that stubborn silence anywhere." The words rippled through the onlookers like a stone thrown into still water. People glanced around at one another, confused. They saw only a blind old man and a highly decorated officer, two men separated by decades in uniform. They didn't know. They couldn't know that once upon a time in the remote highlands of Vietnam, Sergeant Walt Briggs had commanded an infantry unit, and in that unit, there had been a young, green, uncertain second lieutenant named Raymond Mallister, the same Mallister who now commanded battalions, the same Mallister who now sat in briefing rooms that shaped Pentagon policy. And here he was, kneeling in the dust beside his former commanding officer, beside a man whose eyes had gone dark and whose guide dog lay injured in the street. And in that instant, everything shifted. Mallister stood, slow and calm, eyes hardening as he turned toward the nearest security team. He didn't bark. He didn't shout. But his words cut through the air like a knife. "Who did this?" Silence. No one answered, but something in the air had changed. The ground itself seemed to bow beneath the gravity of his presence. "This man," Mallister said, voice steady, "gave everything he had for this country. That dog is not just a companion. He is his eyes, his independence, his life." He let the weight of the words settle into the silence. Let them sink in like iron. "If anyone here thinks this is acceptable, I suggest you say it now." He paused. No one spoke. "Otherwise, step back. This is no longer your scene." There were no arguments, no protests, just motion, small backward steps from uniforms and plainclothes alike. Because now authority belonged to memory, to rank, to a history forged not in laws but in war. And suddenly it wasn't fear that ruled the street. It was something older, something earned. General Raymond Mallister didn't move for a long time. He remained kneeling beside Walt, as if the world had momentarily stopped spinning. Engines idled in place. Jackets fluttered in the breeze. Boots shifted on pavement. But none of it mattered, because at the center of it all were two men. One bent with time and nearly forgotten. The other a living symbol of strength and command, bound by the kind of connection forged in fire, in hardship, in survival, by a war that everyone else had let fade into memory, everyone but them. Mallister leaned closer, voice soft now. "Sir," he said again, "it's me, Lieutenant Mallister, Bravo Company, Pubai 71. Walt's head nodded slowly. His eyes, though clouded, gleamed with something deeper than sight. "I remember," he whispered. "You were the kid who had nearly tumbled into the river trying to catch a radio signal." Walt remembered that day like it had happened just yesterday. A rare, fleeting smile crept across General Mallister's weathered face as he looked down at the man beside him. "And you were the one who grabbed my collar, pulled me back and said, 'Son, don't die for static.'" Walt gave a raspy, broken chuckle, but the pain that shot through him tightened every line of his face. He reached out, trembling hand, brushing over Duke's fur. The dog lay still, conscious but struggling. His breathing was shallow but steady. He was holding on. Walt's fingers lingered on Duke's side, desperate to offer comfort, or maybe to draw some strength from the Maoic's unwavering loyalty. The general slowly rose to his feet, eyes sweeping the scene until they locked on Ethan, the young guard now standing frozen on the sidewalk. His shoulders were hunched, eyes wide, his taser forgotten where it had fallen. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. He looked so young, barely older than Mallister's own grandchildren. I didn't know who he was, Ethan stammered, his voice faint. Mallister's reply came quiet but firm, a blade sheathed in velvet. Don't. The word landed heavy. Ethan stood rigid. The general stepped closer, arms tucked neatly behind his back. Not a gesture of aggression, but one of command. Firm, unyielding. You didn't ask. You didn't even look. You saw a dog. You saw a man who didn't respond quickly enough. And so you reacted. Ethan's head dropped. I was afraid. Mallister's voice cut sharper now. Fear can be understood, but it cannot be used as a shield. He let that truth hang in the air. Then quietly but forcefully, you didn't just tase a guide dog. You tased trust. You tased sacrifice. You tased a man who's given more to this country than you've even lived long enough to grasp. The crowd had thickened by then. People drawn in by the incident had gathered, murmuring quiet, uncertain. Local police had arrived, but none stepped forward. Even they seemed to understand something deeper was unfolding, something that didn't call for interference, only respect. Their hands stayed on their belts, heads low, eyes cast downward. Claire stood firm beside Walt, her hands still gently pressed to his shoulder. Her expression was tight with restrained fury and heartbreak. A few people in the crowd had begun to cry. Most simply watched in stunned stillness, as though realizing they were suddenly part of a story that had started long before they had ever arrived. Mallister stepped back and slowly turned to face everyone. This, he said, voice low but resolute, is what happens when we stop seeing each other. When we let fear decide who deserves our respect. When we forget that the people we pass every day might be carrying more than we'll ever know. He raised a hand, not to accuse, but to show them something plain and true. That man once stood the line so the rest of us could sleep without fear. He gave up his sight so others wouldn't have to give up their lives. And today we made him feel like a threat in his own home. His eyes found Ethan again. The young man was trembling now, eyes wet. I don't care how new you are. I don't care what they trained you to expect. If you can't recognize honor when it's standing 3 feet in front of you, then you're not protecting anything. You're just guarding shadows. A deep silence followed, absolute, unshaken. The kind of silence that doesn't just come from a lack of sound, but from the weight of truth filling every corner of the air. Then Mallister dropped to one knee again, this time placing a gentle hand on Duke's head. The old dog didn't flinch. We'll get him checked out, he said softly, and Walt too. They'll both be taken care of. Walt gave a faint nod. Thank you, General. Mallister looked at him and with reverence replied, No, thank you, sir. And the words sir hung there between them, not out of formality, but as an offering, a restoration. It returned to Walt everything that moment had threatened to take away. His dignity, his service, his humanity. The ambulance pulled away from Jefferson Avenue, flanked by 2 military Humvees. Lights flashed, but the sirens stayed quiet, as if even the emergency had agreed to keep its voice down. Inside the ambulance, Walt lay on the stretcher, an oxygen mask resting gently across his face. His skin looked pale but calm. Beside him, Duke was curled up in a fleece blanket, his breathing slow but steady. One of the paramedics had his hand beneath the dog's head, cradling it with a kind of tenderness that seemed to transcend duty. Duke's eyes had opened now, cloudy but alert. His tail gave a feeble wag against the blanket every time Walt spoke. Just a soft thump, barely there. But it was real. It was enough. At Asheville VA Medical Center, the staff moved with quiet urgency. The call had come ahead of the ambulance. A blind veteran and his service dog had been injured, accidentally under Pentagon oversight. No one questioned. They prepared a private room, made sure everything was ready. Sunlight filtered softly through the window. Walt lay propped up on firm pillows, the dull beep of monitors tracking his vitals. A nurse adjusted his blanket gently and whispered that Duke would be brought in soon. Claire sat in the chair at his side. Her apron was neatly folded in her lap, forgotten. She hadn't moved from Walt's side since the convoy had arrived. Now her hand wrapped gently around his, worn, scarred, but still steady. Her fingers traced his knuckles in silence, anchoring him in a world that finally, once again, remembered who he was. She traced the worn scars along his knuckles with her thumb, slowly, deliberately, like each line told a story she didn't want to rush. Neither of them spoke at first. There wasn't any need. The quiet between them was full of understanding, unspoken but loud. Then the door creaked open and in walked General Mallister. He had shed the formality of his crisp uniform for a plain olive green undershirt. But the weight of command never quite left him. It moved with him, draped across his shoulders like a mantle earned through fire. In his hands was a neatly folded flag. "I thought you might want this close by," he said, placing it gently on the bedside table. "Old habits." Walt let out a quiet chuckle, a sound touched with warmth and history. "Some things you never forget." Mallister pulled up a chair, the legs scratching softly against the floor. He sat. Silence settled in again, the kind that forms between people who've seen too much to need small talk. A veteran's silence, and then the general broke it. "You saved us, you know, back in '71. Walt turned his head, just slightly, his face unreadable. "I did what anyone would have done." Mallister didn't let that slide. His voice was low but resolute. "No, you did what most couldn't." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, the memory clearly vivid even after all these years. "You held the perimeter alone while the rest of us fell back. You called in air support, marked the LZ with your own body. I remember finally reaching the evac chopper, looking back, and thinking, that man just gave up his future so we could have ours." Walt's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "I didn't think anyone remembered." "I never forgot," Mallister said quietly. "Not one day." At that moment, the door opened again, just a few inches, and the nurse came in, carefully rolling a padded stretcher. And on it, there he was. Duke. Alive. Bandaged, yes, but awake. The moment he heard Walt's voice, his tail began to thump softly against the stretcher. "Hey, boy," Walt murmured, reaching out with trembling fingers. Duke nuzzled into Walt's palm with a soft, shaky whine that said everything words couldn't. A mix of comfort, relief, and home. Claire wiped away a tear that had slipped free and gave a quiet smile. The general stood and rested a hand gently on Claire's shoulder. "You stayed. That matters." "I couldn't walk away," she said, her voice barely audible. "Not after what I saw." Mallister nodded, eyes steady with something deeper than thanks. Then he turned back to Walt. "You'll get what you need, Walt. Care, support, recognition. I'll make sure of it. Personally." Walt didn't speak right away. His hand rested in Duke's fur, the other still held softly in Claire's. He took a long breath, then he said, "Sometimes you wonder if the country remembers." He looked toward the flag. "Today, I think it did." And for the first time in longer than he could say, Walt Briggs, soldier survivor, forgotten hero, let himself relax, let himself rest. But Walt's story, as extraordinary as it might seem, isn't just his alone. For thousands of disabled veterans across the country, experiences of misunderstanding, fear, and isolation are a daily battle. Many of their wounds aren't visible. Blindness, PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, mobility impairments. These injuries don't always announce themselves with a wheelchair, a cane, or a service dog. But even when they do, the world around them often isn't ready to see them, let alone support them. A curb becomes a hurdle. Public transportation feels like hostile territory. Paperwork becomes a maze built to frustrate, not help. Far too many veterans who rely on service animals for sight, for seizure alerts, for emotional grounding, find themselves treated with suspicion, even hostility. Some are stopped at bus doors, turned away from restaurants, told to produce documents they're not required to carry. Others, like Walt, find themselves in confrontations they never asked for, because they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. in the wrong body. Security guards and customer service workers, often overworked, underpaid, and barely trained, are expected to make split-second decisions without being taught how to recognize need instead of threat. They know how to spot a weapon, maybe, but not a panic attack, not a PTSD trigger, not a silent plea for space and safety. Marcus Renier, a Navy veteran from Ohio, lost his vision gradually after an IED blast in Afghanistan. One afternoon at a train station, a staff member told him to leash his pet, even though the dog wore a bright red vest clearly marked service animal. When Marcus calmly tried to explain, the staff threatened to have him removed from the premises. Then there's Anita Holmes. She served in the Marine Corps and lives with severe PTSD. Her service dog, Grace, a golden Labrador trained to interrupt panic spirals, goes everywhere with her. One night in a grocery store, Anita collapsed in an aisle. Grace did exactly what she was trained to do. Applied pressure, barked once, and lay across Anita's chest to ground her. Instead of help, a store manager yelled, accused her of faking, and called security. These are not isolated stories. They are everyday truths hidden behind closed doors and forced smiles. And they remind us of this. The burden of service should not continue after the uniform comes off. Recognition cannot end with a folded flag. We owe veterans more than memories. We owe them dignity. We owe them a world that sees them. In the produce aisle, she collapsed. Her body betrayed her, shaking violently as she dropped beside a bin of apples. Instead of offering help, the store manager approached her with suspicion in his voice and skepticism in his eyes. He didn't reach for his phone or offer comfort. Instead, he accused her of faking a seizure, claiming she just wanted attention. Minutes passed. People stared, some confused, others indifferent. It wasn't until a stranger, a bystander who recognized the signs of a real medical crisis, stepped in that help was finally summoned. The moment was brief, but the damage wasn't. Stories like Grace's rarely make headlines. They unfold quietly in grocery stores, in waiting rooms, far from the spotlight. But they reveal something vital we still struggle to understand. The full price of war isn't just paid on the battlefield. It's paid in small humiliations, in isolation, in the split-second judgments may be made by people who don't see the invisible wounds. For so many veterans, the war follows them home. And yet, amidst that pain, something else stands tall. Kindness. Not the sentimental kind, not pity disguised as concern, but the kind of strength that doesn't talk over pain. It listens. It notices. It moves with purpose, not pity. It's the barista who remembers your name, the stranger who chooses curiosity over assumption, the general who kneels beside a forgotten soldier and reminds a city of his worth. Veterans don't want pity. They want dignity. They face storms most of us can't begin to imagine. The very least we can do, the bare minimum, is to really see them, to stop before we act, to ask before we judge. Because if there's one truth this story demands we remember, it's this. Freedom was never free, and we don't honor its cost by ignoring those who paid it. The morning after, Asheville stirred awake beneath a soft, washed-out sky. The sun rose slow and golden, stretching over rooftops and tree lines like warm breath. The city felt scrubbed clean, the light tender. At the Corner Cup Cafe, Claire moved with practiced ease behind the counter, her hands steady around the ceramic curve of two warm mugs. Her apron was tied tight, her posture sure. The quiet chatter of regulars hummed in the background, the comforting rhythm of another day beginning. But for Claire, something in the air had changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was something quieter, something sacred. She glanced out the large front window. Across the street, Jefferson Tower stood framed by brick and concrete. The benches out front were still wet with dew. Everything looked almost exactly the same. But the tension, sharp and electric only days before, was gone. In its place was presence, a calm rootedness that settled in the bones. Outside the building's front doors stood a young veteran. His uniform was neat, his stance upright, disciplined but not stiff. He couldn't have been more than 25, yet his eyes were heavy with something far older. He wasn't there for decoration. Claire could feel it. He was there with purpose. She wrapped her fingers around the mugs and walked out, the little bell above the door jingling gently behind her. The morning air was crisp, the sidewalk warming beneath the first touches of sun. She crossed without hurry, her pace deliberate and light. As she approached the young man, she offered one of the mugs, her voice calm and kind. "Morning," she said. He looked surprised. Blinked once, unsure. "For me?" he asked. Claire nodded, smile easy. "Not many folks start their shift with a decent coffee," she said. "Consider it a thank you." He accepted the mug with both hands, the heat radiating between them. "You knew Sergeant Briggs, didn't you?" he asked after a moment. Claire's answer came without hesitation. "Still do." Just then, from around the corner, Walt appeared. His steps were steady, familiar, and right beside him, as if no time had passed at all, was Duke. The loyal golden retriever walked a little slower now, his gait marked by a stiffness that hadn't been there before, but his nose was lifted, tail moving in quiet rhythm. Walt's free hand rested gently on the dog's back, fingers curled into the fur like a promise. Claire felt her throat tighten. Emotion swelled, but she held it. Walt turned his head slightly toward her voice. "I hear you've been busy saving the world, Claire," he said, a smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. She laughed softly. "Just handing out coffee, sir." He gave her that look, the one he'd always had, patient, steady, the kind of smile that didn't waver in storms. "Sometimes," he said, "that's what changes it." And then, just like that, he and Duke continued down the sidewalk, his hand never leaving the dog's fur. As they walked away, the young veteran at the door straightened a little more, standing just a bit taller. Claire watched until they turned the corner and vanished from sight. She stood still, holding the remaining mug in her hand, heart full. The wounds Walt carried were many. Some had scarred his skin, others would never be seen. But still, he walked. That alone said everything. How many others were walking, silently, with pain no one noticed? How many had been hurt not by battle, but by the quiet cruelty of being unseen, misunderstood, feared, ignored? What happened to Walt Briggs wasn't just one man's misfortune. It reflected something deeper, a truth we avoid because it's uncomfortable. We fail to see those who have sacrificed the most. The veterans who walk among us don't ask for praise. They don't need our pity. What they want, what they deserve, is dignity. A moment of recognition, a pause before judgment. When we let fear speak louder than understanding, when we act without asking, we wound them again. Walt's story is steeped in pain, yes, but it's also a testament to strength, to redemption, and to the simple power of being seen. It reminds us that honor isn't always loud. It doesn't always wear medals. Sometimes it moves with a limp. Sometimes it holds out a cup of coffee. And sometimes it walks quietly beside a dog, still standing, still here. Here is your rewritten passage in American English, staying true to every detail, emotion, and nuance of the original while expanding naturally with professional storytelling language. Nothing has been added that isn't present in the original. It starts with listening, with seeing, with slowing down just enough to truly recognize who's standing before us. Too often we rush past people like Walt, people whose stories remain untold, tucked away in the quiet corners of everyday life, unnoticed by the headlines. There are thousands, maybe more, just like him. Veterans who carry invisible burdens, men and women who are quietly judged or misunderstood as they move through the world. At the grocery store, the airport, walking down a sidewalk. Who they are, what they've lived through, what they have sacrificed, none of it shows on the surface. And their service animals? Often denied entry, met with suspicious glances, treated like pets instead of the lifelines they truly are. These dogs aren't there for show. They're working, always, helping hold together what war and trauma have tried to unravel. But the most heartbreaking part? It's the wounds no one sees, the battles no one hears about, the kind that rage silently deep in the mind, in the memory, in the places too private or painful to speak aloud. PTSD doesn't wear a uniform. It doesn't introduce itself, but it breaks things. And not just within the veteran, it breaks connections, relationships, trust. Sometimes it even breaks the veteran themselves. And what's broken isn't easily fixed. So from the bottom of our hearts, we ask you, have you ever witnessed a moment like that? One that made you stop and really see someone? Have you or someone you love experienced either kindness or injustice as a veteran or as a handler of a service dog? If so, your story matters. Please share it in the comments. Your voice might be the one that helps another person feel recognized, maybe even understood for the first time in a long while. And if this story touched you, especially those of you who remember a time when honor meant everything, thank you. Thank you for staying long enough to hear this. To our veterans, to the service animals who walk beside them, and to everyone who still chooses compassion, quietly, steadily, every single day, we see you. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories that notice what others overlook, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell. Because sometimes it's the smallest gestures, a warm cup of coffee, a gentle voice, or the quiet loyalty of a that can change everything. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.